Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 13th week of 2013. Aware is the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace crew. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and approaching the 12th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Whenever the American people have voted on the matter in these years, they voted against war, but the U.S. government continues to massacre people around the world. As we recall the Bush administration's deceitful mass murder in Iraq, it's important to note that it was not an isolated event. It was part of the U.S. government's policy towards the Middle East in every administration since World War II, up to and including the Obama administration. This program, recorded on March 26th, is devoted to discussing what the U.S. government is doing now in our name, as that is illuminated by this history. We'll discuss the Obama administration's widening of these wars in Southwest Asia and North Africa, and the political conditions in the U.S. that make Obama's mass murder possible. You may have noticed that the president, as in his visit last week to Israel, doesn't seem to want to talk much about the war, much less tell the truth about it. In his inaugural address in January, President Obama said a decade of war is now ending. But that's not true. And of course he knows it's not true. There is in fact no plan to end U.S. combat, even in Afghanistan. Only an announced goal to lower troop levels. And the number of remaining troops keeps growing, in spite of the opposition even of the puppet president we installed in Afghanistan. In his State of the Union speech last month, President Obama announced that 34,000 of the 66,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan will be brought back to the United States within 12 months. But that will leave more U.S. troops in Afghanistan than were there when Obama became president. But Obama's war is by no means limited to AFPAC, the theater of war that includes Afghanistan and Pakistan. The United States is deploying troops in 35 African countries, beginning with Libya, Sudan, Algeria, and Niger. It is as if Africa's proud history of liberation, from Patrice Lumumba to Nelson Mandela, is swept aside as the U.S. buys and suborns African governments, whose historic mission, warned Frantz Fanon half a century ago, is the promotion of, quote, a capitalism rampant though camouflaged. It's the Obama administration, as much or more than the terrorists, who want war in the Middle East and North Africa, consistently with the policy followed by all U.S. administrations for more than a generation. An ongoing war gives the U.S. a justification for military control of the world's energy-producing region. Today, the U.S. government is threatening, invading, and occupying countries in a vast circle with a 2,500-mile radius around the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to the borders of India and China, a region sometimes called the Greater Middle East. The U.S. military calls it Central Command. This region has the world's greatest concentration of oil and natural gas, and our government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars month after month to control it. Control, and not just access to these energy resources, is what our government demands. We, in fact, import very little of our own oil supplies from the Mideast. Most of it comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of world energy supplies gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. This past June, the Senate committee chaired by President Obama's new Secretary of State, John Kerry, released a report describing how Washington needs to maintain key military bases and troop presence throughout the Middle East, which is vital because the region is, quote, home to more than half of the world's oil reserves and over a third of its natural gas. The United States should preserve the model of lily pad bases throughout the Gulf, said the report, which permits the rapid escalation of military force, enabling the United States to quickly deploy its superior conventional force should conflict arise, close quote. In other words, President Obama is killing men, women, and children in Asia and Africa in our name because China and other countries need oil, and our government intends to have control over where they get it. Our government says that we are conducting these vastly expensive wars to stop terrorism and protect civilians. But we can see that instead we're killing civilians and creating terrorists. These wars are not in Americans' interest because it's the 1% who profit from them through armaments and oil. The Obama administration's innovation in the U.S. war in the Mideast and Africa is to add assassinations by drone or death squad. The U.S. Special Operations Command is now amazingly active in 120 countries, according to the command's spokesman. President Obama has killed between 3,000 and 5,000 people, including at least 200 children, with drone attacks on Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, countries with which we are not at war, and some of which are supposed to be our allies. The U.S. and NATO have bombed and killed Muslims in 8 countries during the Obama administration, after Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Mali, and even the Philippines. And that does not count the numerous lethal tyrannies propped up by the United States. In different circumstances, President Obama recently said, quote, "There's no country on earth that would tolerate missiles raining down on its citizens from outside its borders." Of course, he was talking about Israel. And of course, that's exactly what he's doing, including killing American citizens with his rockets. Obama's problem is the American people, who, in spite of war cheerleading by the media, do not want more war. Therefore, he wants to find an effective way to lie to them that the war is winding down, even as he expands it. President Bush, in addition to launching a lying invasion of Iraq 10 years ago, kidnapped people around the world and tortured them in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. Obama simply murders them. History will record that our chief executive is a practiced liar as well as a murderer. The program of the current administration seems to consist of assassination, austerity, and anti-environmentalism, just as the 1% desire. You're watching Aware on the Air. Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana is made up of people who believe that if Americans actually knew what the U.S. government is doing in their name, they would be appalled. Tonight we'll have some comments from members and friends of Aware, and then some videos on the war and the interest behind it. Our friend David Johnson is here, and we'll start with Ron Szoke on recriminations.
Recriminations is a term that might be applied to a lot of the reflections on the 10th anniversary of the Iraq War. And there have been, of course, recriminations both against those who supported it and those who opposed it. Some are even still claiming today that the Iraq War made the USA itself safer than it was. This seems to be a totally absurd view, but there are still a few people with some credentials who will advance it as a kind of apologetic move for waging the war against Iraq, which I think has done so much to destroy, obviously, Iraq and the USA itself, and in particular, the American military. As a symptom of what went on about 10 years ago, I'd like to call attention to a piece by Chris Hedges, published in Truth Dig and then repeated on Bill Moyers. Moyers himself is interesting. He has moved from a mildly liberal position, I think, as a speechwriter and House intellectual for Lyndon Johnson to a more and more radical position, and I think because he has become more and more honest and insightful about what's going on. Anyway, Bill Moyers has published in his online blog, What Matters Today, a piece by Chris Hedges called "The Day That TV News Died." And Hedges thinks that he can spot that day and tell you when it was. That's when the network fired Phil Donahue for opposing the war. There's an interesting story here. Hedges sometimes writes very vividly, shall we say, and dramatically. So maybe a 5 or 10% discount is possible. But he wrote, I am not sure exactly when the death of television news took place. The descent was gradual, a slide into the tawdry, the trivial, and the inane, into the charade on cable news channels such as Fox and MSNBC, in which hosts hold up corporate political puppets to laud or ridicule and treat celebrity foibles as legitimate news. If I had to pick a date when commercial television decided amassing corporate money and providing entertainment were its central mission, when it consciously chose to become a carnival act, it would probably be February 25th, 2003, when MSNBC took Phil Donahue off the air because of his opposition to the calls for war in Iraq. Donahue and Bill Moyers, the last honest men on national television, so you could, again, question that. But anyway, were the only two major TV news personalities that presented viewpoints of those of us who challenged the rush to war in Iraq. General Electric and Microsoft, MSNBC's founders and defense contractors that went on to make tremendous profits from the war, were not about to tolerate a dissenting voice. Donahue was fired, and at PBS, Moyers was subjected to tremendous pressure. An internal MSNBC memo leaked to the press stated that Donahue was hurting the image of the network. He would be a difficult public face for NBC in a time of war, the memo read. Donahue never returned to the airwaves. So if someone as relatively meek and mild as Donahue and Moyers could be eased off the air or pushed off the air because of their opposition to the war, you can imagine what happens in other cases. For the most part, TV news people, commentators, pundits do not say things that others would call irresponsible. It's not prudent to do so, and they know that. They know where the money's coming from. And even PBS, I think, has been humbled by this consideration that if they get too far to what's called the left or opposition to the war or to corporate interests generally, it will have an effect. And we already heard it, for example, in the campaign of Mitt Romney and some others to defund PBS. And this was turned into a really silly issue about Big Bird and children's television. But there's a deeper issue there, I think. So let me go on here. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan depended upon corporate corruption from Wall Street. That is not why they are paid, the news media. They are paid to stymie meaningful debate. They are paid to discredit or ignore the nation's most astute critics of corporatism, among them Cornel West, Medea Benjamin, Ralph Nader, and Noam Chomsky. They are paid to chatter mindlessly, hour after hour, filling our heads with the theater of the absurd. They play clips on their television of their television rivals, ridiculing them, and ridicule the rivals in return. News looks as if it were lifted from Rudyard Kipling's portrait of the Bandar Log monkeys in the Jungle Book. The Bandar Log, considered insane by the other animals in the jungle because of their complete self-absorption, lack of discipline, and outsized vanity, chant in unison, "We are great, we are free, we are wonderful, we are the most wonderful people in all the jungle. We all say so, and so it must be true." And this sounds a lot like American exceptionalism to a lot of people. So other pieces appeared in HuffPost. Iraq, 10 years after, have we learned a thing? Well, I think that's questionable. I didn't bring in my owl this week, indicating that the owl of Minerva has not yet really flown for a lot of people. And when it becomes even darker, maybe a few people will begin to notice that wisdom that always comes too late, it seems, to really be very helpful to us. So think about this, please, how you reacted when we were building up to the war hysteria that took over around 10 years ago. The war drum became louder and louder, and a lot of people were caught up in it and are now regretting it and engaging in recriminations against those who insisted that we had to take immediate and military action against this horrible terrorist foreign enemy. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ron. Got a response to this Kipling-esque analysis, David?
I don't know what I
Have you
can
never
add to
kippled?
it. I mean, this is just an excellent analogy. I'm going to have to go home and look up that and actually
thing.
reproduce it. But, that's really interesting, Ron, because for me, when I noticed a change in the media in this country was back in 1979, 1980. The last year Jimmy Carter was in office, when there was a hostage crisis, and the way the media treated the presidency of Jimmy Carter, basically every single night on the news, across the screen, day 13, day 112, day 267, day 300, every single night. I have never seen the media in this country treat a sitting president before or since that way. I mean, it was an obvious bias. It was obvious that they wanted to make sure that Jimmy Carter lost the election coming up in 1980. Not to say Jimmy Carter was that great a president, but you have to understand, he got elected mainly on a popular wave of people that were sick and tired of the things that had preceded 1976, basically the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, the Church Committee hearings on the abuses by the CIA around the world, and people wanted to change. And there was this peanut farmer who really was an engineer, an entrepreneur, got elected, and he was outside the traditional politicians at that time, and really his first 2 years in office looked like the country was starting to head in a better direction. But I think toward the last two, really Jimmy Carter started paving the way for what we're suffering under now. He began deregulation. He listened to people he shouldn't have listened to, as far as Big Neff Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. They basically, destabilized the popular government in Afghanistan. This is back in 1979. Mm-hmm. They gave sanctuary to the Shah of Iran, who was a brutal dictator that the United States basically overthrew a democratically elected government in 1953 and put him in power. And gee, I wonder why the Iranian people were resentful of that. Yeah. So, I mean, that's to me when I think television died. That was the beginning of it. And of course, after that, there was the whole sort of fluff way the media at that time treated Ronald Reagan. I mean, the man, if there was any real journalism in this country, the man never would have got elected to a second term. I'm convinced of that. But the downward spiral, if you will, about quality media in this country continued under Bill Clinton. Was the one who probably did the next blow to it by passing the Telecommunications Act, which further consolidated the concentration of the corporate media, which resulted in fewer voices being heard, unless, of course, you towed the corporate state party line. I think that is especially so when I saw Phil Donahue speak here in Champaign-Urbana about, I believe, 5 years ago at a national media conference, and he specifically talked about what happened to him at MSNBC, and it's really interesting. Basically, he said that when he first started out in television, that there was a lot of locally produced programming that went to syndication, and he said then over the years, basically through the 80s and 90s, that all this became consolidated in media conglomerates that basically homogenized everything, pushed away any kind of different or dissident voices. And he was told by his producers before he was fired is that he was not to have any anti-war people on his program. When he challenged this, they finally relented and said, okay, Phil, you can have one anti-war person, but then you have to have 5 pro-war people for every one anti-war person you have on. And he refused to do it, and therefore he lost his job. I mean, you got to admire the man for sticking to his principles. But this is what it's become. I mean, we have entered a state in this country to where we have a media that is not the freest in the world. It resembles more of Pravda in the old Soviet Union. There is a corporate state party line that has to be adhered to. This is reinforced by corporate advertising money, and also the fact that the networks themselves are huge corporations that make tons of money every election cycle through all the campaign contributions that the candidates need to then turn around and give to the network televisions in order to get their message out. So it's a vicious circle, and this is unfortunately has resulted in the tragedies that we've been experiencing here the last 30 years, 20 years, and in the case of the wars in the Middle East, the last 10 or so years. If the media had been doing its job, I sincerely believe that the American people would have been in such an uproar that the invasion of Iraq would never have happened.
I think that's quite true. The Carter administration has gone down the memory hole to such an extent, David, that it's only when we've had later examples of presidents who've been elected with a popular demand for hope and change and who have betrayed that in the course of their presidency, whether they wanted to or not. I'm not talking of Ron often cautions us against talking about the internal decisions of political figures, but we certainly can talk about their effects. Mm-hmm. And one of the effects of the Carter administration, as you mentioned, was the establishment of Al-Qaeda. That it was the Carter administration, notably Zbigniew Brzezinski, as national security advisor, who was responsible for rounding up the worst possible religious fanatics they could find in the Middle East and sending them into Afghanistan to, as Brzezinski says, give the Russians a Vietnam of their own. Well, that was the source of Al-Qaeda, which, and there was the classic case of blowback, as it is described when 9/11 occurred, because of course this came out of exactly those people that had been formed by the Carter administration to harass the Russians. This history, this story, for example, as you referred to the history of Iran and the fact the United States was responsible for putting the Shah in office, overthrowing a democratic government, this history is not known by most Americans, but as you say quite rightly, it is known by the people of the rest of the world, specifically the people that we're attacking and oppressing. We can't expect that not to have an effect.
You know, they always try to justify, I mean, not just this massive network of military bases. I mean, how many foreign military bases do we have in the United States? I don't think any.
Well,
none at all.
Well,
So-
it depends upon how foreign military. Yeah, it was President Correa of Ecuador who closed down an American base in Ecuador, and he said, "Oh, he'll leave it open if the Americans would give Ecuador a base in Florida." But somehow the Americans didn't want to do that.
But they always try to claim that their foreign policy, first of all, they know the facts and the American people don't,
Yep.
and that they're doing this in our own best interest,
That's
that they're
right.
basically, they're the guardians that are basically doing what has to be done to protect the American economy and the American people's safety, and it's all lies.
But
The
what
only
they're
ones
actually-
it benefits is the 1%, like Carl mentioned earlier, especially the oil industry and the war profiteering armament industry.
That's exactly right. And when they're called in, for example, even when they're called into court on it, they say, "Oh, well, these programs are secret. We can't tell you about their state secrets here." So if you're saying that we're doing something wrong by killing children with drones in Pakistan, we really can't talk about the program. It's a secret. We're keeping you safe.
It's interesting. Many people have dated this shift in the media and the tone of the media to the Carter administration.
Mm-hmm.
I think the best that can be said for Jimmy Carter, he may be a good person, but he was naive, criminally naive, some would say, about what was going on in his administration. And it was the beginning also of this massive shift of wealth upward to
That's a
the
crucial point.
1%. That was apparently the inflection point during the Carter administration. And we've seen what's happened since, a greater and greater concentration of wealth in the pockets of the wealthiest.
Which began with the deregulation of the trucking and airline
Yes,
industry, if I'm not
yes.
mistaken.
Which was brought to us by, notably, the staff of the late Senator Edward Kennedy, the cutting edge of deregulation in the Senate. So it's,
Wasn't aware of that, Carl.
yeah, no, that was where it came from. David and I were actually talking before the show started about the 30-plus year campaign of the 1% that really hasn't had a name even in American, certainly not in the American media, but in American discussion. There is a name for it. The rest of the world talks about it under the term of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism has recently been described as capitalism with the gloves off. It is the reaction beginning in the 70s of the American ascendancy, the American 1%, to the scare they got from the 1960s. In 1975, a book was published by the Trilateral Commission, an essential part of the American 1%, under the title "The Crisis of Democracy." The crisis of democracy was that there was too much of it around. That the 60s push was a push for democracy, and we couldn't have that, said the 1%, because, and they were echoing here James Madison at the time of the writing of the Constitution, there will be an assault on the riches of the opulent. And we've got to stop that. Mainly what they had to do was stop what is now being called by the media entitlements, that is social supports like Social Security, Medicare, and things like that. That's the grounds of that was the aim of the attack. Neoliberalism was a conscious program. It is a conscious program, and in a sense, it's won. The fights that we're having now and the fights we will continue to have as the Obama administration wants to institute its own version of austerity will be fights that are prompted by the conscious neoliberal policy of the American 1%. There's a lot more to be said about this, and the war is intimately involved with it. You've been watching Aware on the Air, brought to you by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. You might be interested in these other programs seen here on Urbana Public Television, now streaming online, by the way, at urbanapublictelevision.org. Notably, Democracy Now! Every weekday morning at 7 a.m., The Big Picture at 8 a.m., Fridays at 7 p.m., News from Neptune, and Sunday at 4 p.m. David, what are you doing at your Sunday program this weekend?
Well, this Sunday we're going to have an interesting program called Gas Hole. And it's basically
Say
about
again?
the gas hole. It's basically about how the oil companies have suppressed technology to increase miles per gallon and auto efficiency, and a lot of other things, on the political and economic realm to basically rip off the consumer. And also I want to mention real quick, too, that on Saturday, April 13th, on the World Labor Hour on WFT Radio, it's on Saturdays from 11 to noon, we're going to be having Robert McChesney, former professor here in the U of I, who's written a really great book that came out several years ago called Rich Media, Poor Democracy, and he'll be on Saturday, April 13th. He'll be on the interviewed actually from 11:30 to noon on 90.1 FM WFT.
In fact, he has a new book out on the economic crisis too. So I have a chance to talk about that during your program as well. That's great.